Greetings and welcome to The Thirsty Mage, the podcast that's never too old to go back to the humble beginnings of JRPGs. I'm your host for this episode, Jordan Rudek, and this week we're discussing a newly released book called Fight Magic Items and the individual who penned it, while also reminiscing, as per usual, about some of our favorite titles mentioned therein. Joining me on this episode is someone who is happy to have a book club related to the hobby he enjoys the most, and that's David Lloyd.
That's pretty much the only way you'll convince me to read a book these days. I only have so many hours, and they're usually dedicated for video games. But unfortunately, this episode, I am fighting a cold, so I'm going to have to keep my responses, succinct. I'll have to limit my Octopath jokes to the number of times that there's eye contact in the game. So, not very many, obviously.
Someone from your kid's school cast poison on you, and we don't have enough remedies or healing items. Take your pick of RPG healing item, I guess, to cast on you. But you did say you were on the mend, David, which is good. And I think you're not the only person who has been maybe struggling a little bit. The beginning of fall, that second cold that comes around, not too fun to deal with. But
yeah, I guess the answer is to homeschool, but I don't make that kind of money, so.
That's right. Well, I mean, you might have been forced to homeschool the last couple of years at some point too. So
I've kind of had enough of that too. So
that's right. And our special guest this week is a fellow British Columbian and the author of Fight Magic Items, and that's Aidan Moher.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on today. Books and video games, and specifically Japanese RPGs, have just been my thing my entire life, and so bringing them together in this one book, Fight Magic Items, has been such a joy, and talking to other people who have read it and experienced these games and love them as much as I do has been just such a heartwarming experience over the past little while now. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, our pleasure for sure. What's funny is kind of the genesis of this episode is a friend of the show, Daniel Scott, on Twitter. I think he must have quote tweeted or shared a tweet about your book, Aidan, and the idea that it was coming out. Maybe, I don't know if you had mentioned in that tweet, the idea of, wanting to connect with people to kind of get the word out, or to, hop on a podcast or something like that. But at any rate, Daniel kind of linked us together there in the Twitter sphere. And that's, I guess that's kind of magically how it all happened. I reached out to Aidan via Twitter DM, and we talked about if we could have him on the podcast. You got a couple of copies of your book sent over to David and myself. We've read through it in preparation for the episode, and the rest is history. So, I just wanted to give a shout out to Daniel for making kind of being the person to make this all happen. So appreciate you, Daniel. Thanks for that.
Daniel has been the source of a few episodes. I feel like there's been a few tweets where it's like, you should do this. And we're like,
oh, absolutely, yeah. When he throws it out there in public, and we feel compelled to do it for sure.
Yeah, just entice other people. If you want something done, you got to yell at us on social media.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's the power of networking, right? Like, you put your ideas out there, manifest it, and when you find that right community, they kind of boost each other up. It's great.
I mean, this is networking in 2022, I guess, is someone retweeting someone else who does something or talks about something that you already talk about, and then let's talk about it together. Why not, right? I wanted to just so people can get to know you a little bit, Aidan. If they haven't heard of you or heard of your book, who are you, and how did you get into video games, writing about video games? What other kind of stuff have you done outside of the book?
Yeah, so I am a writer and a games journalist. I'm a Hugo Award-winning editor and critic with kind of online writing and journalism that goes back to 2007 at this point, when I started a blog that covered science fiction and fantasy books called A Dribble of Ink. So I started that in 2007. I was fresh out of web development university course. I wanted to flex, those skills and bring in something else that I love. So I ran A Dribble of Ink for a number of years until 2015. And along the way, I won a Hugo Award, and I made a lot of, really great friends and developed just that desire to continue to write about the things that I love, and recognizing that there's space to write about the things that I love. And so after I shut A Dribble of Ink down in 2015, I kind of moved into freelance writing, mostly about science fiction and fantasy books, continued to do that for a while. And then a few years after that, I was thinking back to where, when did I get into video games, and what was my, first kind of true love in that space. And I've always loved Japanese RPGs, going all the way back to like Final Fantasy 3 on the Super Nintendo and Chrono Trigger.
Mm-hmm.
I've written about them, and previously I wrote about Final Fantasy 3 on my blog before I shut it down. And I was like, I play a lot of modern Japanese RPGs. I continue to keep up with current games, but like, do I still have that creative juice, to go back to those retro Japanese RPGs and still love them the way I did when I was a kid and they were new? They are very different than modern Japanese RPGs in many ways, right? Like they require more from the player to interpret what's happening. Like the game happens as much in the player's head as it does on the screen. And I love reading. I do that. It's very similar with books. And I said, can I still like these old games? So, I went back at that point and loaded up 2 Super Nintendo games and played 2 Super Nintendo games that I knew like lots of people loved. They were classics, but I had never experienced. So I was going into it with like nostalgia for that era, for that style of game, but not for those games in particular. And that was Lufia 2 and Terranigma.
Okay.
And they're both pretty short. They're 20 hours-ish each. And I blasted through both of them, just loved it. And I was like, oh, okay, I like clearly still do love old school JRPGs the way I did when I was a kid. And so that leads me into sort of becoming a games writer, because I took that idea and I said, you know what, like not only am I loving these, but I'm recognizing that like these games inspired me as much as the books I was reading at the same time. And so like I'm also a fiction writer, right? So I write books, I write epic fantasy. I'm working on a big fat epic fantasy book right now. And it's like, it's as inspired by Hironobu Sakaguchi as it is by Tolkien. And so I took that concept and I said, if I feel this way, other people feel this way. And I reached out to a bunch of, because I had, ties to the science fiction fantasy community. I reached out to a lot of authors and said, hey, like who else feels this way about Japanese RPGs? And so I spoke with authors like Scott Lynch, who wrote The Lies of Locke Lamora, Tamsin Muir, who wrote the Caro the Ninth. Her new book, Nona the Ninth, just came out. They're really popular. She loves Illusion of Gaia. And I said, okay, here, like this is a story, like this generation of writer, science fiction and fantasy writer who is as, inspired and influenced by Final Fantasy as they are Lord of the Rings. And so I wrote that piece.
That's fascinating for sure.
It was, and there was so many people, authors that I connected with. So I wrote that piece for Kotaku, and that was sort of my entry into professional games writing. And it really hit a nerve, not just with writers, but with like fans everywhere and writers all along the spectrum, from, like established writers to, aspiring writers. And I had people DMing me being like, why didn't you talk to me about this piece? And I went, okay, like, what is it? What is it about these games? And so I started writing more about Japanese RPGs as a professional games writer, but also always incorporating like that. Why do we love these? Like, what is it about playing these games as kids or teenagers and now as adults? Like, where is the core of that nostalgia coming from? And that sort of became my beat as a games writer, looking at these older retro games, this experience, how to experience retro games in a modern era. And, at a point, I had a good friend named Eric Smith, who's a literary agent, and he emailed me and he was like, hey, when are you going to write this book? This book is perfect for me. Like, let's do this. Yeah. And we did. And it became Fight Magic Items, which is a history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. So it's this sort of like just long time coming percolation of all these interests that I have, these experiences that I've had over my life that I realized are shared experiences with so many millions of people, whether they played the same games that I did as a kid or a teenager, or whether they played different games but experienced the same feelings. So I kind of wrapped that all up into a book about the history of the genre that we all love.
I think you're mentioning this idea of kind of looking back at older games to just to kind of check or confirm that it's not just nostalgia that kind of drives our love of these games or maintains our affection for these old games. And I think that's something I not struggle with, but I'm often reflecting on or contemplating is if I go back to something like Chrono Trigger, will I love it now as much as I did back then? Or will do I want to taint those memories of that game? And I was very happy to go back to something like Final Fantasy VI and realize that it is still an incredible experience, and you
Mhm.
can, it's not just, rose colored glasses that you're looking at that game from, when you first played it when you were 8 or 10 or 12 or something like that. You go back and play it now and it still does feel like an RPG tour de force. So interesting to hear you talk about two games you hadn't played, Lufia 2 and Terranigma. I played Lufia. I haven't played Terranigma before because I don't think that ever got a North American release, if I'm
Mhm.
not mistaken. So going back to that one, it was funny you bring that game up. I just last night loaded it onto my analog pocket. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna play Terranigma finally because
Yeah.
people keep talking about it. It came up in your book, and I'm like, okay, I have to play this at some point, right? So I'm gonna get on that. But
Make sure you patch
oh,
it with the 60 hertz patch.
okay, I'll do
Much
that.
better. Yeah. Yeah.
I've heard that before, and I need to make sure I have
Yeah.
done that with this version
It's
that I've got.
essential.
So
Yeah.
I'll make sure.
Well, we
Yeah, go ahead.
started Lufia 2 at one, like we were going to do, I think it was Lufia 2 that we're going to do an episode on. That was the Game Boy game, right?
No, that was
That
something
was a
else.
late Super Nintendo game. Yeah.
Yeah, Lufia 1 and 2 were on Super Nintendo. There is a Game Boy Color one. I can't remember, Lost Ruins or something. I can't remember the name, but
Oh, yeah. I'm
it's a
pretty
little bit
sure there was
different.
like a Game Boy Color game that we had started, and then I think like, if as many episodes often do, we planned it and then something distracted us.
That one is it's a little bit wonky. It's got some different mechanics too. It's not such a straightforward RPG. Like it's got nine people in your party or something like that. And I remember there being some difficulty curve issues that might have stumped us a little bit there too. It was one of the few Game Boy Color RPGs that was actually on the 3SE shop. I think that's why we
Oh,
downloaded that to play that,
that's
right?
I remember.
That's why we snagged it because we were
Was
just kind of
yeah.
dumpster diving and see what we could find on the eShop. But
I think that was like when the 3DS was they had officially said like it's the eShop is going to be going away, and we're
might be
like, okay,
right, yeah.
what's on here? And I think that was what we had picked.
That's it, yeah. Aidan, I wanted to ask, so kind of knowing about your history is great, kind of how you got into video games, writing specifically.
Mhm.
Fight Magic Items, the book just released yesterday?
Yesterday. Yeah.
Yesterday. Okay, fantastic. So I want to know, how did the actual writing of the book come about? Like I kind of see like where you were kind of, led to, pushed into, kind of generating ideas for sure. But the actual writing of it and that whole kind of even up to the publication of it, like all of that stuff I want to know about.
Yeah, so it was a pretty intense like writing period. The book, like the very first idea of the book came about 2 years ago when Eric, who became, is now my literary agent, approached me and said, "Hey, like I think there's an idea here. I think we could make this a book." And the original idea we started talking about was like just an essay collection, like just taking the stuff I had written professionally, putting it into a book. And I kind of looked at that and I said, yeah, like I really love the kind of core ideas that run through all of the pieces that I write. And I think that's compelling, but there's not enough of them to make a book. Like it wouldn't have been long enough. Right. So then, we started throwing ideas back and forth about like, okay, well, like here's like the games you've written about or the ideas you've written about, you place them on a timeline, then maybe fill them in with, exclusive essays. So you'd have a mix of reprints and new essays and stuff. And we took that idea, ran with it for a bit. But then as we massaged the pitch and the proposal more and more, it was like, okay, this history is so big that I think to get like a real book out of it, it needs to have that sort of like narrative and timeline that starts somewhere and then, like follows a journey, because Japanese RPGs are all about that journey. Right. And so we looked at that and we were like, how can we take that idea, like the idea of a journey, a little, like first level adventurer kind of, they fight some battles. They might do a couple dungeons around their village. They level up, and then eventually they cross the bridge. They leave the castle. They cross the bridge into the greater world, and that's sort of where things, balloon and and change. And so we took that core idea from Japanese RPGs and then looked at that history and found like the through lines are really, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, their creators, Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, and how their lives and their approaches to games created the genre, how other creators responded to that, how Horii and Sakaguchi sort of went on divergent paths, and what that means now, like right at the very end, like Horii and Sakaguchi are still making games. And that's like such a fabulous idea, like writing a history that exists where like the creators of something you're writing about are still alive and working. But at the same time, Sakaguchi, he's doing interviews for his latest game, which is Fantasian. And he's like, is this the last game I'm ever going to make? And that's just, so we saw this compelling narrative of taking this idea of these like, first level adventurers, setting out to do something magical and kind of going through this journey over the course of their life and creating this genre. And then checking in on all the other, the side characters and the new party members that you bring on that have had their own impact on the story of the genre going forward, and taking that and exploring it all through the West, like the lens of Western gamers, because I think, like the story of Japanese RPGs and how did this strange little genre from Japan that was like very specifically designed and created with the idea of making a Japanese version of a Western concept, which is like the CRPG, right? Wizardry and Ultima.
Right.
They wanted to make like a Japanese living room version of that. And like even by Final Fantasy VII, they were still designing games for a Japanese audience. So like, how did this genre that was like very Japanese become so big in the West? And then how has kind of the West and Japan, like those ideologies and those approaches to game design, how have they blended together? How have the two sort of game design philosophies and cultures and people, how have they sort of inspired each other in turn? And there's this very interesting cyclical effect, like Western games inspiring Sakaguchi and Horii to create Japanese RPGs, and then those Japanese RPGs going on to inspire games in the West. And then, then Final Fantasy 15 taking like clear inspiration from something like Skyrim with its open world, right? Or Final Fantasy 14 taking on, World of Warcraft, and seeing the interplay and the back and forth between those two, regions in the world that create some of the best video games in the world, and how that all kind of comes together and plays together has been really fascinating.
One thing that struck me, maybe we can all think about something surprising from the book. But just before we get to something about the book or reading it that surprised us, one thing I just wanted to kind of bring up in thinking about this book is the subtitle, The History of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the Rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. Sakaguchi is this recurring figure in your book, and it struck me while I was reading, like you keep coming back to him. It just made so much sense because his imprints, his DNA are kind of all over the place in the genre, right? Like it's not just the games that he made, and I'd forgotten about this, but his fascinating kind of departure in Mistwalker and what they were doing with Last Story and the 360 games like Blue Dragon. And then all the way to Fantasia. It does feel like it's almost a history of him as well. You can't kind of take those things apart, right? The history of JRPGs and the history of this one very, very influential creator, they're inextricably linked. And like for his name to keep coming back up just made so much sense.
I think he's like so symbolic of that idea of like this merging of like Japanese and Western game design, and audience as well, and like. Sakaguchi, like he lives in America now. He lives in Hawaii. Like many of the Final Fantasy games were made in the States, right? Like most people probably know that Final Fantasy 9 was made in Hawaii mostly. And that inspired like the tropical setting in Final Fantasy 10. So like America's fingerprints and Hawaii's fingerprints are on Final Fantasy 10. Like the opening in the tropical setting is like inspired by, Hawaii and America. But like some of the early NES games, like Final Fantasy 2 and 3, like not the ones on the Super Nintendo that we all played in the West, but like the original NES ones that didn't come out until a lot later, were some of them were developed at least partially in Sacramento because their programmer was an Iranian American named Nasir Gabelli, and he had to come back to the States because he could no longer work in Japan. And so instead of replacing him, they just brought development over to the States. And so like Sakaguchi has always had that connection to the West from the very early days of his career. And that that story comes throughout, right? Like his final
For
game
sure.
that he's put out so far, that he keeps saying like, is this my last game? Like it was published by Apple, right? So like he's now made that leap. He's now like, being published. He had a relationship with Microsoft during the Xbox 360 area, and now he's like working directly with Apple, which is one of the, like the definitive iconic American companies. And
Mm-hmm.
his story throughout, like, we start with him right at the beginning, and the book's very last chapter is about him looking back and thinking about all of this kind of change and this journey that he's gone on. And it's I don't know how you could write the book without it. And every game keeps coming back to those roots of like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, and how those creators sort of inspired everybody else along
It's
the way.
hard not to feel a little bit, melancholy, or that bittersweet feeling that Fantasian could be his last game, and because it makes you think like just how much of his output, his creative output, has influenced not just the games that you play, but just the games that everybody plays, and not just JRPGs. Like how many people have played, how many game creators have played JRPGs and gone on to make beloved games in other genres too. They've interacted with his art, and they've come away with ideas of their own to put out into the world too. And so just you kind of getting to the end of your book and thinking, oh yeah, we might not see another Sakaguchi game. Just felt like, that kind of sucks. Like it's a shame. But I guess we'll see. But
And he's always been so driven to like find the next best thing, right? Like
yeah.
he was sort of famously like prickly and difficult to work with, because he was never happy with whatever they had, whatever they were working on. It was always like, okay, but how can we make it better? Like, what's the next thing that we can do?
Mm-hmm.
And so like, I feel like that's defined like the way that Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest have diverged. But I also think it explains a lot of Final Fantasy's appeal in the West over like Dragon Quest. Where it's kind of reversed in Japan, and to eventually lose that, and just that inspiration of, seeing somebody who's constantly trying to improve. Like even in Fantasian, in a lot of ways, it's very traditional in terms of Japanese RPG mechanics, but he also looks at like, okay, grinding in JRPGs, like nobody likes it. What can we do about that? So like something, like he created that, him alongside Hori created the idea of like, these random encounters and how that's gonna, like you kind of have to grind through some of those games. Like Final Fantasy 2 was super grindy, but 30 years later, almost 40 years later, he's like, okay, what can we do about that? So much time has passed. How can we make this idea that I sort of helped popularize and make it better? And like losing that drive, that kind of creative passion is absolutely like, there are other amazing people out there making games. But I think when you lose sort of the first generation of like creators, the people who laid the first bricks, like you do reflect on that in sort of a melancholy way,
One of my favorite solutions to that problem of grinding of random encounters was in Bravely Default, where you could adjust the random encounter percentage from 0 to 50 to 100 all the way up to 200%. So you could basically choose when you want to have battles or when you want to grind. And I thought that was such an elegant solution, and I'm surprised we haven't seen something like that in more games. Fantasian has an interesting solution to that as well. But I wonder if that's something we will see more of in the future, is creative ways to take random encounters and non-boss encounters and do something kind of playful, interesting, giving players more freedom and choice in terms of how they progress in the game in that way. I wonder if we're going to see more of that, or at least I hope that we see more innovation in that sphere, specifically when it comes to JRPGs.
I think we will. Like, I think that accessibility is such a huge thing right now, right? Mm-hmm. Like in gaming, as it should be. Like we're seeing such great advancement in accessibility. And I think stuff like random encounters counts in that, right? Like everybody should be able to enjoy a game and see it to the end, is my belief.
That's it.
And I think Japanese RPGs have, like you say, they've dabbled in a lot of interesting ways to kind of take that out. Like Radiant Historia was a Nintendo DS JRPG. It's like very story heavy. Then they kind of remastered it for the 3DS, but they gave you the option to just take out battles.
That's right.
And so it basically became a visual novel with boss battles along the way, which was really interesting. and like looking at what people, what do people really love about these? Like they love the stories, they love the characters. Lots of people love the systems and the
Hmm.
combat systems, but like, can you find a place where like a we don't have to think of like Japanese RPGs as like having to be 100 hours long. Like I'm playing
Yeah,
Xenoblade
sure.
Chronicles 3 and I'm enjoying it, but I'm 60 hours in and I'm not near the end. And like, that's too long. But if you go back and you look at like the Super Nintendo RPGs that we all love, like I replayed Final Fantasy VI a year or two ago. I did everything in the game in 35 hours.
Yeah.
Right? Like I can do a clean playthrough of Chrono Trigger, not even trying to speed run it in 17 hours, right? Like
Hmm.
Final Fantasy IV is probably 20 hours. So like the history of the Japanese RPG it doesn't go back that far that like JRPGs were allowed to be shorter. And so I think like a
Sure.
lot of the grandiness that we see, especially in modern games, is due to this idea like, Persona 5 is way too long. It's like 100 hours when it should have been like maybe 60 tops. But this idea
Mm.
that it has to be that long. And I think if we could look at that and take the idea of Japanese RPGs and like maybe we're fighting fewer battles, but maybe they're more, complex or they're more like puzzle oriented. Like I really like
Hmm.
Cosmic Star Heroine by Z Boyd
Yeah, it's
Games
great.
because like what it does, it gives you all of your resources back at the end of every battle. So all of your, items and spells and hit points and everything comes back. So you start every battle fresh. Every battle is like a little puzzle and you have to figure out how to solve it, and I think that that's really interesting. It's just, you go all out, you use every tool that you have at your disposal and you just beat that battle because
Yeah.
you get everything back at the end. Octopath Traveler, I think, was it didn't do the replenishing your resources thing, but it was very like, it was almost like a little puzzle game. Like you had enemies with weaknesses and you had to figure out like, which order do I need to take these out in so that I can then like take out the big guy in the back, in one or two fell like swoops because you could break them. And so like you see sort of like these more clever adaptations that require you to sort of puzzle through situations.
Hmm.
And I think that's really appealing. And can you get to a place where you fight fewer battles, but they're more meaningful? Or
Yeah.
can you just turn them off and enjoy the story? Like I'm super over leveled in Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and I just run past all the enemies right now, and I like it. Like I don't need to fight field fodder all the time to feel like I'm
No,
making
exactly.
progress, right?
Yeah.
And so there's so many ways to do it. And then adopt, like it can be adopted into other genres. You can adopt other genres like into Japanese RPGs. I've always felt like a replay of Chrono Cross with like your maxed out characters. Like combat becomes trivial and it almost feels like a visual novel to me. Like that's really
Yes.
interesting. You start to see the lines between genres blurring when you aren't overcome by random encounters and the necessity of just like grinding through to get gold or experience or whatever.
We did a Chrono Cross episode a few months ago when the remaster came out, and I
Yeah.
joked to David that I'm kind of at one point I was playing it like a Pokemon game. I just want to recruit all
Yeah.
the characters.
Oh,
I
totally.
don't.
Yeah.
I've already finished this game once. I don't really. The story's fine, and music is obviously fantastic. But like I
Mhm.
feel like I could just play that game as something completely different by
Yeah.
not focusing on the combat, not focusing on other
Yeah.
things that are going on. I'm just kind of, how do I get all the characters? Like I'm trying to
Yeah.
catch them all at
Yeah.
this point, and I think
Chrono
a game like that lent itself to that kind of experimentation.
Chrono Trigger is even better at that. I feel like New Game Plus
Yes.
runs are like this like adventure game, right? And like you can run any party in that game, and it's just fun. Like you play through, it takes 9 hours, and you play through with just like different party configuration, or
Yeah. Yeah.
you just do the side quests at the end game like in a different order, and it's like you're kind of creating this like bespoke experience every time you go through, and it doesn't like it feels like a story and adventure without all the like added JRPG systems that you may not want at that
Yeah.
time. And then sometimes
It
you
was a
do, and you go
very
and find a new one, or you go find a different game, and that's great too. But options are so good, right?
definitely. Um, uh, Moving on, I wanted to, and David, we'll start with you for this one. I wanted to kind of just touch on something that maybe Aidan, for you writing the book, and for David and me reading the book, something about what we read or what we wrote that really surprised us, or kind of something that we discovered, or maybe hadn't thought about or learned for the first time, something that surprised us. David, is there something in the book that kind of took you off guard a little bit, or caught you off guard, I should say?
Uh, Maybe just the amount of games that like I feel like we play a million games,
Yeah.
and and like I'm fairly focused in the RPG genre, so it's like I'm always playing, and we're always looking for retro and stuff. But
For sure.
even still, just discovering new titles that you just didn't realize were as popular as they were, or had a bigger impact. Like I remember like Grandia coming out on, like, there was the remasters that came out on Switch.
Hmm.
And I remember seeing them, and I'm like, I've never heard of these games. Like, why do I care? And then seeing like, oh well, it was actually a big deal back in the day, because for, I think it was like this, they were Sega Saturn, or um, they
Dreamcast,
were like
maybe? No.
A Sega staple or whatever. And I like in my neck of the woods, like in our neighborhood, nobody owned a Sega. Like nothing. Like there was no Genesis, no Dreamcast, no Saturn.
Yeah.
Nobody owned anything Sega. So anything on Sega was just like, we didn't even hear about it. So when you hear, and then even like stuff like Phantasy Star, like again, it's like, I may have heard of the names, but I never thought of them as being all that important.
Hmm.
So it's neat reading about the like how it's like, oh, these were a big deal, back then. Like you can't just ignore them.
Hmm. I mean, they were a big deal for somebody, right? They were a big deal for someone who owned those consoles. And maybe, if you didn't own a Super Nintendo, maybe Chrono Trigger, the Final Fantasy games weren't as important to you, right? Or not, you might have known people that played them, but you're like, I've got my Phantasy Star. I have my other games to play, right? Depending on what platform you had at home. For me, something that surprised me while I was reading the book is, and I knew this, but I just hadn't really thought about it, or I guess, hadn't thought about it in a while, was just the time in between Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest releases. When these games were first coming out, it was a year or 2 years or 3 years. But then later on, between like 12 and 15, for example, or 13 and 15, I should say, when you're getting in the 6 to 8 to 10 year range between sequels, it's just kind of wild, right? I think there's something in there that Dragon Quest 11, there hadn't been a mainline entry. I guess the last one would have been 9, given that 10 was online. 10 plus years between those releases as well. It just seems wild to me that these huge, like, two of the biggest JRPG franchises, if not the biggest ones, could go a decade or almost a decade between mainline releases. It just seems insane to me that actually happened, but it did happen. And now we're getting more of them. It doesn't feel like between 15 and 16 Final Fantasy, it's not gonna be 10 years. We know FF16 is coming soon. And the same thing with Dragon Quest 12. We have a logo for that, that is actively being developed. It's probably a year or two away, maybe, but I don't know, that time gap between those releases specifically just seemed wild to me, and it's something maybe we wouldn't really see ever again.
Well, just shows you how much they struggled during that kind of PS3, because it overlaps, like the whole dark era of the JRPG, which you mentioned in the book, kind of overlaps with that time period of the PS3, Xbox 360. The Japanese developers just really struggled, and
Yeah.
and it's clear with the gaps in those mainline titles that it's like, yeah, they definitely did.
And then this year, you see, and we were talking about this recently. Square Enix publishing, developing, feels like dozens of games this year. And you're not seeing, or maybe when there is that 10-year gap between a Final Fantasy releases, but this year now it's like, oh, we're just gonna keep pumping out everything. The production is just prolific now.
2 games a week.
It feels like it. Aidan, what about you?
Especially like I
sorry,
just want to say,
go ahead
like,
first.
especially as adults, right? Like, in the book I talk, and one of the things that surprised me is like sort of the reverse of what you're describing. Is I forgot how close like mainline Final Fantasy games used to come out. Like they announced Final Fantasy 9, 10, and 11 at the same time. Like, can you imagine if they announced like 16, 17, 18 at the same time right now, and then they came out like within like 12 months of each other? Like, that's wild. But like back then, you'd get a Final Fantasy a year, then you'd get Grandia, and you'd get Lunar, and you would get Suikoden, and you would get like, everything else. But like I had time for that. Whereas like this year, 2022 has been really great for JRPG releases, but like, again, Xenoblade Chronicles is like 120 hours long. And so now I have Live Alive, and I have Diofio Chronicle, and I have Bravely Default 2, and I have all these games piling up that are just, I don't have time to play. Like the pace is picking up. But as adults, you just don't have that space you can devote to like, powering through a full RPG in 2-3 weeks, like I could when I was in high school during this like golden era where you're getting so many Japanese RPGs.
You kind of have to plan around it, right? You have to almost like know in your calendar when is this game coming out that I'm really looking forward to. I'm not going to start something before it. I'm not going to plan to play a game a month after it. Like I'm really going to devote my time to this one thing that I'm really looking forward to. And you kind of have to make it part of your monthly, yearly calendar, like these bigger releases. It's the only way you're going to get through them given their size now.
I poured like 160 hours into Elden Ring. Surprisingly, I wasn't planning on buying it, and I did, and I loved it. But then, like, I saw Xenoblade on the calendar. Exactly what you're describing. I saw Xenoblade there on the calendar.
Yeah.
And it was, I knew it was going to be big and long. I was expecting maybe 60 hours, like the second game, not double that. But I was like, okay, I want to play that on release. So I just chipped away. I went on to howlongtobeat.com and I was like, okay, how long is Life is Strange True Colors? Okay, 9 hours. Perfect. How long is 13 Sentinels? Okay, it's like 20 hours. Perfect. I just squeezed in these shorter games because I didn't want to get caught flat in the middle of something. Because I look back on some of the games that like I've finished or half finished. Like there's an omission. We were talking before we started recording about Trails in the Sky. And I played about half of the first chapter on PSP, which was like 40 hours, but like then something else came out, right? You put 40 hours in and something else comes out. You always intend to return, but you never do. And I didn't want that to happen. And as an adult, you really have to kind of think through and plan through that play schedule. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. I wanted to, I think this is kind of related to what we're talking about, things that surprise us, but I wanted to just touch on each of our individual biggest RPG blind spots or regrets, however you want to consider it, a blind spot or regret. For me, David mentioned the Phantasy Star games, and I've played the first one. I played that one when it got re-released. I think it was on Switch. There was that M2 did a really interesting job, kind of bringing that game to Switch as part of the Sega. I can't remember, Sega Classics or something like that. Not the 3D Classics. Some kind of collection that they did.
Sega with Ages, I think.
Ages, that's the one. Thanks, Aidan. Yeah, so Sega Ages, I ended up playing that game. I really enjoyed it, and I have access to Phantasy Star 2, 3, and 4, and I've heard so many good things about 4 that I have to play it. But again, not growing up with the Genesis, these games just were not on my radar at all. Like I was a Final Fantasy kid. When I got my DS, I became a Dragon Quest kid. But in addition to Phantasy Star, I guess Phantasy Star is more of a regret that I haven't played those games yet. Kingdom Hearts is to me more of a blind spot. Like Kingdom Hearts is a game where I know so many people enjoy it. The story seems convoluted, but interesting if you're invested in it. And there's just so many pieces to that Kingdom Hearts universe now. It feels like that it just feels overwhelming that I don't know that I will ever get to those games. I don't know that how worthwhile it would be for me to just play one of them. And then to not play the rest, am I missing out on a really amazing, coherent story when it all comes together? If I only play a fraction of them, but Kingdom Hearts is a game or a series that I wish I got into at some point, I guess.
I don't think anyone's ever described Kingdom Hearts as coherent.
Okay,
but
that's an outsider.
I'm pretty sure that's the last adjectives anybody would use for Kingdom Hearts. That's good. But, no offense, Kingdom Hearts fans, but I think they'd even agree. However,
that's good. Well, that will help me sleep at night for not having played Kingdom Hearts. Then, what about you, Aidan? An RPG blind spot or regret? Something you still wish you could get to at some point that you haven't really dove in too far yet?
Yeah, I mean, like if we want to break it down as like a regret and a blind spot, I think that's fun. For me, far as a regret, I want to go back to Trails in the Sky. Like, I really love that 40 hours. And I know that Trails, like the Trails of series, or Trails series, not Trails of, that's I get Tales of and Trails.
Yes, I know. I always try to catch myself.
Trails in the Sky. I've played a lot of first chapter FC on the PSP, and I really loved it. And I love the sort of like industrial take on a fantasy world. I love the really like earnest, kind warmth of that that game, and I love, the way that it has this interlinking story across multiple
Mhm.
titles, across multiple series. Like, it brings in, like, in one of the chapters in the book, I talk about the idea of, like, I see JRPGs sort of on two divergent lines around the PlayStation era, and that's like what I like to call like the Saturday morning JRPGs, and those are your Lunars and your Grandias that are very very like effervescent and warm and kind,
Mhm.
and have that, like, that feeling where you play them and you just like, it's just really enjoyable, right? And they're often like styled off of that 16-bit generation
Yes, yes.
type of JRPG. And then on the other side, you have like the Vagrant stories and the Final Fantasy sevens and stuff like that, which I call in the book primetime JRPGs. They're a bit more serious. They're chasing more mature sort of themes and stories. They often diverge a bit in gameplay and explore a little bit more. Trails in the Sky, like, it's obviously very recognizable as like a 16-bit JRPG in its structure and its systems, but I feel like its story kind of straddles that line between those two. That it has, like, it takes the idea of like Suikoden's like complex multi-game plot structure and like nations with all like that all has this sort of interlinking relationship, like that hooks into the story, that reveals itself slowly, sometimes over the course of
Mhm.
multiple games. Like, that's very Suikoden, and that kind of falls into that, to me, that like primetime JRPG era. But
Definitely.
then it takes on like that sort of like kind, warm-hearted, just makes you feel good feeling and theme and texture from like the Grandia and the Lunar games, and merges them into one. And so like everything about it is just, like, it should be right up my alley, and I love what I've played. But it's like, it's one of those game series that, like, the PSP games I found very slow, especially combat, and that's all been fixed. There were the remasters on the PC, which are really great. I've played a bit of the first one. It's like, they've done a great job upraising the graphics. They've added a lot of quality of life features that makes it a really, really great experience. But I
Mhm.
don't game on my PC enough. So like, if they release that on Switch tomorrow, like, I'll buy it and I'll spend 150 hours playing through both games. Like, I'll drop
Yeah, I mean,
without blink,
I'm
right?
the exact same boat where like
Yeah,
PC is just not the number one place where I'm playing.
yeah,
But
yeah,
gosh, yeah, if any Trails game that I haven't played before, haven't
yeah,
finished before, came to Switch, I would play it day
yeah,
one. And
yeah,
just recently reviewed Trails from Zero, which I know
yeah.
you've just mentioned picking up,
I just
Aiden.
bought it.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
Fantastic quality of life features there.
yeah.
My favorite among them is the ability to speed up
Yes.
combat.
Yeah,
But here you can speed up combat, you can speed up exploration of the world, but you can actually adjust them. Like, it's not just a set press a
yeah,
button, it turns on.
yeah,
You can actually determine how fast the speed up function is, which is fantastic. And I'd
yeah.
never seen something like that before, that you could have two different speed up
Mhm.
settings, one for combat, one for outside. And those can be like they have kind of sliders to them that you can adjust. So
Yeah, that's
yeah,
fantastic.
I totally get what you're saying about going back to the PSP games and kind of feeling that slowness to them. And yes, they're fantastic. And David can attest; these are some of his favorite games of all time. But yeah, I really keep hoping for seeing more of those games come to modern consoles would just be fantastic.
Yeah, and just like become more accessible. Like, I think that they with like the Trails of Cold Steel games, they really kind of like started to emerge into like a bit more of a mainstream audience. Like, they found more
Yeah.
popularity than the Trails in the Sky games, and so like reintroducing them and like making them accessible to a new generation of fans, I think, is really important.
Hmm.
Um, and then when we talk about, so that I would say is a regret. Like, I regret not getting
Okay.
that. For me, a blind spot would be like Sega RPGs a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I was a Nintendo in the book. I write about how, like, I was a Nintendo fanboy, and then Square jumped ship to Sony, and so that was
That's
like
right.
that moment in my life where it's like, oh, what am I gonna do? Am I a Nintendo fan? Am I a SquareSoft fan? And I followed
Yeah.
the games over to PlayStation. But I never had a Genesis, right? My friends had Genesis, right? I saw the Saturn in the store, but it was like $700. So of course my dad wasn't going to buy it for me.
Hmm.
And so like, I went back and like, I've explored a lot of Fantasy Star while researching this book. So I feel pretty like familiar now with Fantasy Star. So I wouldn't call that a blind spot anymore, but
Okay.
Sega in general, has always been a blind spot in my life. And one thing that I wanted to write for the book so bad was like a big deep dive into how the Sega Saturn is like one of the best Japanese RPG consoles of all time. Like,
Mm.
it's loaded with amazing Japanese RPGs. It has the best version of Grandia. It has the best version of, other Japanese RPGs. That has Panzer Dragoon Saga, which is incredible, which is another regret for me. I've never been able to play it. So it's like this really fantastic Japanese RPG console, but only in Japan. Like it doesn't.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
They didn't come over. We got Dragon Force, but then didn't get Dragon Force 2 and all the Shining Force 3 chapters and stuff like that. There's so many games, but they never came over here. And so with the books sort of focus on like Japanese RPGs in the West, everything had to like tie back into like, how did this shape the genre and the culture and the industry? And the Saturn as a JRPG device was like, it didn't, like there was Panzer Dragoon Saga came out, but it was in like such small quantities that it now costs a fortune. And so it didn't impact the West in the way that it did the Japan. And I would love to explore that. And I want to pitch it. I want to tell that story. It's a fascinating story, but that remains a blind spot because, I never owned a Saturn. I bought one 6 months ago, and like in a day or two, I'm going to get an optical disc emulator so that I can, take discs. Because one of the cool things about the Saturn is you can get a lot of discs and games for like super cheap from over there. So I imported Lunar, I imported Grandia, and now the fan community has created patches so you can take the English localizations from the PlayStation versions of those games and then patch them on to the superior Sega Saturn versions of those games. And so I'm really excited to go back and take these games I loved during my teenage years on the PlayStation and experience them in their sort of like, like a more improved form on the Saturn. And so like, I'm really excited to explore that library because it has been a big blind spot for me.
Cool. David, what about you? Blind spot, regret? I know we've all three of us, or at least Grandia keeps coming up. I guess see that on your list, but there's something else here as well. Blind spot for you.
Yeah, I think it must just be a Canadian tradition that we all started with Nintendo and then we became PlayStation fans.
Yeah,
because that's basically how it went for me. But had an NES, then N64, and then Final Fantasy went over to PlayStation, and then I just followed suit. Mm-hmm. And but one of the things that came from that is that when I became a PlayStation fan and Microsoft came out, I'm like, screw the Xbox, like I'm not buying that crap.
Yeah.
And then Sakaguchi leaves to Microsoft, and I just like, no, I'm I love you, Sakaguchi, but I just have no interest in buying an Xbox. So I just never played the games that he was making over there. So I never played Blue Dragon. I think it's Last Remnant. I always
Lost Odyssey.
Lost Odyssey. I always get them. Yeah. So I actually own Lost Odyssey. I did purchase it on my Series X. I haven't played it yet, but I just haven't played those era of games. It's almost like a teenage rebellion of like, I was kind of a late teenager. I guess I was around probably in my late teens at the time, and was mad that he had jumped ship to the competitor. So I was, it's kind of this latent refusal of like acknowledging that he left Final Fantasy. So like that's kind of like the antithesis of like, well, these are the games he's making now. It's like, no, I want you to make Final
Fantasy. Crawling back and played Fantasia on Apple. So I don't know, like you've learned your lesson as an adult or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I did play Last Story too, but
that's true. Yeah, we did. Yeah.
Isn't it weird though to look back at that era and be like, if you didn't play the Xbox Japanese RPGs, you kind of missed out on the like what could be considered the peak of Japanese RPGs during that console era. Like PlayStation 3, like it didn't have much more than that. And I think like looking back, the Sakaguchi games and Tales of Vesperia, like they're very like straightforward traditional games. So while Square was trying to like reinvent the wheel again and like kind of galaxy braining themselves into this situation where they couldn't do anything with Final Fantasy, like Sakaguchi and the Tales of teams sort of made these pretty straightforward traditional Japanese RPGs that I think are considered by many to be, some of the top tier console JRPGs at the time. And of course, like the handheld systems were really, really rich with JRPGs. That's where you really wanted to be to play them.
That's where I was playing them for sure.
So weird to me to look back and be like, oh yeah, like if you didn't have an Xbox 360, like you really didn't have any JRPGs to play, right? PlayStation and I mean the Wii was a little different because it was standard definition, but it still didn't have a ton of JRPGs either. Weird time, really weird time.
Yeah, it was for sure. Yeah, I can totally understand why that would be a blind spot for a lot of people. But the fact that you can get Lost Odyssey and Blue Dragon for like
$5.
$5 or less. They seem to constantly go on sale, so people should pick them up for sure. Lost Odyssey does something really interesting with its storytelling. It's got this collection of short stories in the game that's just absolutely fascinating, and probably worth the price of admission alone, I'd say.
Yeah.
Let's move away from blind spots and regrets to just the memorable moments. And I know, Dave and I are going to share a couple that our audience has probably heard before. I tried to think of a couple new ones for us, but maybe we could start with you. What for you would be like just an incredible, memorable moment for you in a JRPG? Something that's just always sticks with you, and you can maybe find yourself thinking of it from time to time. Is there one that comes to mind?
I mean, there's one that there's sort of an interlinked one between two games that really formed like the core of the story in the book when I started to sit down to actually write it. And that was like my first experience with JRPGs, but also the experience when I finally actually fell in love with JRPGs. And so like the very first one was like, I was probably like, so I don't know, I was probably 7 or 8, and I had a Game Boy, and I was like really into like Super Mario Land and Follow the Foot Clan, like action platformers and stuff. So I was playing those and really loving it. Loved my Game Boy, took it everywhere. And one time I was with a friend and went to his cousin's house. His cousin had a Game Boy as well. I was like, okay, this is cool. We're going to be friends. And, the cousin says like, hey, you want to check out this game I'm playing? I'll check out your game. So we trade Game Boys. And, I'm moving this character slowly around this weird grid-based map. And it's really slow. It's kind of like a board game. Nothing's really happening. And then all of a sudden the screen shatters and there's this big tiger enemy in a menu. And I'm like, here you go. Not for me. This is lame.
Yeah.
That game was that was Final Fantasy Legend 2 on the Game Boy, which is not actually a Final Fantasy game. It was rebranded for the West, but it's actually a Saga game, which is made by Akitoshi Kawazu, who sort of infamously makes these sort of infamously like strange, sometimes unfun, but always interesting games. I really admire Kawazu's contributions and his
for sure
the way he takes risks and explores design space. But I would never, ever in a million years recommend one of his games to Japanese RPG someone play, right? And so for a number of years, I thought I hated Japanese RPGs. I was like, I don't like those. Those are lame. But then one night, and this is probably the memory for me. One night my babysitter came over and he was like, this cooler 16-year-old kid, friend of the family. He'd come over all the time and we'd play Doom and games on my PC, Commander Keen. And then I got a Super Nintendo. It was my first game console that I owned outside of my Game Boy. He brought over a game for my Super Nintendo and popped it in after my younger brothers had gone to bed. And it was Final Fantasy 3. And so we were exploring the Mines of Narshe, and there's the music and there's, the story and everything. And I have this super clear, super vivid memory of stepping onto the very first save point in that game. And the screen sort of flashes this bluish white color and it pings and makes this really iconic, memorable ping sound. I just remember this feeling of warmth and safety and realizing how tense and how invested I was in the story. And at the same time, I had been getting into epic fantasy novels and science fiction novels. And I was like, this is Lord of the Rings, but I can play it. And from that point forward, I was just a fanatic. And so and that kind of leads into my next game experience that sort of shaped me through memory and the things that I kind of took from it. And that was Chrono Trigger. So I scoured every magazine to figure out what is Final Fantasy, who made it, and what are they making next. And that was Chrono Trigger. So I got Chrono Trigger finally for my birthday, and I played through it. And it took me a while to play through it the first time. But then I remember I beat it and I immediately started a new game plus, right? And I started it probably on a Saturday morning or Friday evening. And I remember playing and getting to the Kingdom of Zeal, which is, probably a third of the way, halfway through the game. It's also where the game's big twist happens. And I remember getting there in 2 days, and I remember like saving and having to go to dinner and just spending the whole dinner chattering at my parents about how, like it had taken me 2 weeks to get to Zeal the first time, and now I can get there in 2 days, and just like
Yeah.
how like invested I was in that experience of like not just like playing a game and then moving on, but like playing a game and becoming like, so invested in it that it becomes part of like, my identity during that period I'm playing it and outside of that period. And Chrono Trigger's remained like just an immensely like important game to me over the years because of that emotional connection that I made to like this game that I beat and didn't want to like move on to the next thing. I wanted to experience it all over again, and Chrono Trigger does that so well. And so that experience of like rushing through and just like blazing through the first half of Chrono Trigger in 2 days it came out in 95. This would have been early 96. So I was like 12. As a 12-year-old, like just blazing through that first chunk of Chrono Trigger in 2 days, and how proud I was like of that accomplishment. And now I look back and I'm like, well, yeah, it was New Game Plus. Of course it didn't take as long, and now I can beat all of Chrono Trigger in 2 days if I wanted to. But at the time it was like, that was where I went from being like really like excited about Japanese RPGs to like being obsessed with them and this idea and incorporating them into my life is like as much as I could, in the same way that I was like epic fantasy novels and stuff.
I imagine that there are many people that after playing Chrono Trigger for the first time, they're like, "Oh, this is the type of game I want to keep playing because it's so good," And
but then everything changed, right? Like their next game was
probably
Final Fantasy VII, which was like totally different. And I have a strong memory of Final Fantasy VII too. Like my friend who had the PlayStation, like he always got the game consoles, and he got Final Fantasy VII, and we stayed up all night playing through Midgar. And I just remember like stumbling out of his house the next morning and like somehow in my stupor convincing my dad to buy a PlayStation and Final Fantasy VII. And we went to the Sony store, and I still don't know how I convinced him to spend hundreds of dollars on this.
They were pretty expensive, right? PlayStations were still pretty expensive. Yeah.
And like, he was always an early adopter of technology, so he's always curious, but I would say it was a fair investment. Here I am, 25 years later with a book about those games.
Panned out for sure.
Yeah.
David, what about you? What are some of your memorable moments? I know one that you're going to mention for sure because we've talked about it before. But
yeah, I'll follow the same sort of structure where like so my first kind of experience with RPGs would be the original Final Fantasy on NES. The moment of crossing the bridge and getting the start of the story. Like I remember as a kid thinking like, man, that was a short game. Cause I'm like, the end credits are like after the first hour, and then realizing like the game just started actually. So, finding all that out. So just that moment was kind of my first to jump into those games. The game that made me fall in love with RPGs is Final Fantasy VIII. I actually played Final Fantasy VIII before I played Final Fantasy VII. I don't even remember how or why, but I played 8 first, and I'm sure people make fun of me, but the moment when Squall, sacrifices himself to just so that Renoa won't die alone, was a very emotional moment, like a very powerful moment for me, and it's like a kind of like that game in itself really solidified like, okay, this is my life. Like I'm going to be playing RPGs on video games for now on. So like I ended up going back to play Final Fantasy VII, and obviously that was a great experience. And then just consumed RPGs from then. And like now I kind of live for moments like I had mentioned one in the notes here where like the moment of I guess this is a bit of a spoiler for Persona 4 where the main protagonist, I can't even remember, I think his name is the main guy, where like in the final boss battle you actually can't win, like you end up dying, and then all of your teammates kind of reanimate, like basically like motivate the character to get up, like you can't die, you're too important, sort of thing. And to see all the characters like explain what the main character meant to them was a very powerful moment.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And then the biggest one, I guess, for me, especially lately, is in Trails in the Sky second chapter, the moment when Joshua and Estelle reunite
Mhm.
is just incredible. Like it's like it's funny because we were talking about these blind spots and trails is something that I only recently discovered it, and I've it was only 2 years ago, but I've already played through every copy of the game. Like I played through the first trilogy. I've already played both of the Crossbell games, and I played the 4 Cold Steel games, and I think I've played every game at least once, some of them twice, one of them 3 times, all in the span of 2 years. So it's a lot of moments in trails
Mhm.
that are just that's my jam now.
For sure. I'll just I want to get to the next topic and spend a little bit of time there before we head off here. But I wanted to bring up one of my experiences that's just super memorable to me. And I've played the game many times since, but I always kind of remember that first time is playing Earthbound when it first got on Super Nintendo, and I never owned the game. We must have rented it, but the the moment when kind of Ness goes back to his house after the kind of meteorite incident, and you're kind of given this quest, and you're going to go out into the world really for the first time, and you walk directly south of your house and into the town, and you start to see just regular everyday places. It's not the inn, it's not the weapon shop, it's not the armor shop. You see a drugstore, you see a hospital, you see a hotel, you see an arcade. And I hadn't really played a game like that felt like I was just exploring like a real life town. Um, and the way that Earthbound, so much of it is just like this is America, this is Canada, this is just a regular world, like our world. It felt like you're just kind of really just having your own adventure as a kid again, going back to when you were Ness's age or younger, and just roaming about your town. Almost you are kind of role playing in the greatest sense of the word there, maybe. And just that experience of playing Earthbound for the first time, it's always struck me, and just something I always kind of hold close to my heart, I think. And why that game has so much fondness for me is just seeing what an RPG could be. It didn't have to be fantasy or science fiction. It could just be something set in a real world like ours, and I think that's what really keeps Earthbound something that's always top of mind for me. Lastly, before sorry, go ahead.
Can I just touch on that for a sec?
Please,
I think that's like I really love this question. I was so happy to see it in the show notes because I think like what we're talking about here is like really the core of what I wanted to write about in Fight Magic Items. Like it's a history. It goes through the history. It's like well researched. There's interviews. There's lots of lots of source material, and it follows the making of games, but it's about the people who make games and the people who play them. And like talking about this, like I'm listening to you guys describe these memories and these experiences and these relationships that you have with these games, and I've played some of them, right? I haven't played others, but like even in the instances where like you're describing something in a game that I haven't played, like the Trails in the Sky second chapter scene with Joshua and Estelle, like I know what you guys are feeling there, right? Like
Yeah.
I've experienced that. We've all experienced these same things. So like even if we play different games, even if we came through the genre on along a different path, we've all kind of had that shared experience of what it is to experience and emotionally invest in these games. And to me, that's what I find so fascinating about Japanese RPGs. And I could have written a book that was twice as long and tried to cover twice as many games. But as I was writing the book, I realized like, okay, I can't include every game in here. And so I included these highlights that are scattered throughout the book. There's about 40 of them. So I can kind of bring in a name drop and highlight games throughout the book that aren't touched on in the main narrative necessarily. But I knew I couldn't include everything. It couldn't be the entire history. It would be a humongous Wikipedia entry, right? Like 400 more pages. But what
It'd be an encyclopedia as opposed to a novel size.
Exactly. Yeah. And so like what I could take is take these stories that you guys are describing and we're talking about here, but instead of trying to be one book for everybody because it lists everybody's favorite games, I kind of twisted it, and like in a way, it's almost like the book's almost a bit of a memoir in places, and it's not quite a memoir because it's not about my particular life, but it's about like those shared experiences that I know so many other fans and people who pick up and read the book will, like, even if they haven't played that game, they'll go, yeah, I remember that. It wasn't with Suikoden, it was with, Tales of Destiny, but like I did that too, and I felt that too,
Yeah.
and that universal experience of like, just bonding with these games is so great, and we carry it with us. I think to the point where I've written a book, and you guys have 183 episodes of a podcast, right?
Yeah, exactly.
About these games and games like this, right? We create opportunities and reasons in our life to continue to have relationships with these games and stuff. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, well said, Aidan. And thanks for adding on there. I want to just kind of quickly go through our last topic here, and obviously, Aidan's book is about history, but I think it'd be it's fun to kind of look forward, and we do this sometimes here on the Thirsty Mage. But thinking about how JRPGs are evolving or changing in the future, what do we think is going to what is going to happen next, and David, maybe we'll start with you for this one. What do you see kind of generally happening for the genre in the future?
Well, just when you kind of listen to the developers now, like I'm pretty sure Katase was talking about this when they were talking about the direction of Final Fantasy 16, and I know with Trails, like the Nihon Falcon president was saying the same thing, where they're saying, the kids that are starting to play games now are the ones coming up. Like they don't want turn based, unfortunately. Like it seems to be becoming a more niche or kind of a relic of the past. Like the kids nowadays, they want action based games. So now you're seeing these traditionally, like Trails, I think, is kind of the perfect example, because like Trails of Cold Steel, like Cold Steel 3 and Cold Steel 4, I would argue is maybe arguably the best turn based combat system in all of RPGs. Like of everything I've ever played, it's my clear winner. Like it's the best. It's perfection for me. But now I haven't played because we're waiting for the localizations. I haven't played Kuro 1 or 2, but from what I heard, there's like it's now moving more towards action based, like a hybrid at this point, or maybe one day it'll be even more closer, like might even be more indistinguishable from Ys sort of thing, like where they're working towards that. And then even Final Fantasy, like Katase just flat out said, like, we're not going back. Like Final Fantasy 15 was action based, and that's where 16 will be, and that's where they'll be going forward. So it seems like the kind of the flagship stuff, or the main, where the big budget games are going, are all going action based. I'm just kind of happy that Square's not giving up on the niche. Like you're seeing a lot more experimentation. Like I really enjoyed Triangle Strategy. I'm glad they have like they're experimenting with strategy games, and they're playing with other, now they got Diafield, which uses like an action based strategy. Like it's all in real time. There's no, sitting back and coming up with a strategy. It's like all on the fly. Like it's really seems like we're going towards, a lot more experimentation. And I mean, I guess that's probably a good thing. There's still, I know the indie scene is there's still lots of turn-based games to play and to get our hands on if we still want to kind of live in that generation. But it just certainly feels like JRPGs are going into the torch has been passed, and now we're going on to a new generation.
You're going to scare the Dragon Quest fans if they hear any more about Dragon Quest 12 becoming an action game or becoming something different, right? I think there was some talk about
holdout.
Yeah, they tried that. With
Aidan,
9,
what about you?
right?
Yes, that is true. That is true. That was a departure,
and it didn't go well.
No, it did. And so they went right back. Well, after the online game, 11 was very traditional combat.
Well, like 9 at one point was an action game. Like it had action-based combat, and then fans were like, "This isn't good," and so they put a turn-based combat system in. But I think David's spot on about a lot of this, and I think we are going to see like a push towards like the high end mainstream part of the genre, going towards that sort of mass appeal market where I think all games are becoming the same game. At this point, right? Like you're seeing like Japanese RPGs take more and more and more influence from, like Western RPGs, but also like character action games. And that's, Final Fantasy VII is becoming the confluence of all popular, like mainstream game design. Then, like that's sort of always, that fits in with what Sakaguchi's always been doing, which is always pushing and trying to find something new and something exciting that can reach a mass audience. Dragon Quest 12, whatever it ends up being, like we know it's going to be a lot more like traditional, right? No matter what happens, and it'll sell a ton in Japan and it'll sell decently well in the West. But I think there's just room, and I think we're going to see growth in all areas of Japanese RPGs because, like, as the top end, like Square with Final Fantasy and their top tier franchises tries to chase that mainstream audience, like David says, there's more and more sort of like smaller franchises that they're spinning up that allow them to satisfy some of those smaller, more traditional experiences. And I think the Switch has been such a blessing for Japanese RPGs because in the same way that like the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS and the PSP created this like low stakes development environment for the genre during the HD era, I think we're back to another place like that where like it can be really hard to build a AAA Japanese RPG nowadays. It's just too expensive. But we're seeing games like Ayuden Chronicle coming through like, crowdfunding sources, and like it's going to run on Switch, right? So like they have this sort of like, there's not a lot of technological like boundaries anymore. But, I think we're seeing a point where like there's recognition, especially because of the success of crowdfunded projects like Ayuden Chronicle. We're seeing that like there's an audience for that type of thing. And so as long as you, scope your project properly, you aren't expecting and you're not required to sell, 7 million units, 10 million units like Final Fantasy is. Ayuden Chronicle can be a huge smash success if it sells 800,000 units, right? If it sells 1 million units, like I think that would exceed lots of expectations. And that's an okay place to be. And it creates like this environment where people can, pursue something that doesn't have to appeal to every JRPG fan and also everybody who also likes Horizon and Elden Ring and stuff like that. And so I think we're going to continue to see companies pushing in that direction and recognizing that like, oh, we can make sort of like not lower budget in terms of like low budget, but like games that don't have to cost as much as Final Fantasy or even Dragon Quest that can find an audience, a really consistent audience, sell to those, explore really interesting, like unique design spaces. And maybe they don't sell to the 12-year-olds, right? But who are they? Like they're selling to the 38-year-olds like me, right? And I'm bringing those games into my house and I have kids and they're going to be exposed to that type of game. And so I think like, the genre when it started, there was only one audience, right? It was just everybody. It was 12-year-olds and 17-year-olds and 22-year-olds. But now we have, the genre has matured and you have, dads like me who want games that sort of appeal to that sense of nostalgia and like look like what I kind of have always enjoyed an art JRPG to be. And it's not really what Final Fantasy 16 is doing. I'll play that and I'll enjoy it. And like, I'm a Final Fantasy 15 apologist, but like, I am really looking forward to Ayuden Chronicle and Sea of Stars, like these games that are like more traditional in what they're trying to do and do it really well. Right? Like not everything has to push boundaries. Some things can pick a lane and then just do it really well. And I think we're going to start seeing a bit more of that in the indie space, and then seeing like the success of Ayuden Chronicle and its Kickstarter motivating Konami to, spin the Suikoden series back up. Like I never thought we would see Konami put out another Suikoden
Neither
game.
did I.
Now we're getting like the HD remasters of the first 2 games. Like that's incredible. And that to me shows like, even in that like, big publisher realm, they're like, oh, okay, like there's legs here. Suikoden's not going to sell 5 million units, right? But it's going to do pretty well. And I think it's going to, like really satisfy, like a business case that knows it only needs to sell 500,000 units to like really be a success. And so I hope that like, like capitalism ruins art all the time, right? But I hope that like, the crowdfunding space and also the fact that like, the games are being created for like the first time. We have people running studios, directing games, creating these games who grew up with them, right? Like we've only ever known these games. And now the people who grew up playing Final Fantasy and Phantasy Star and Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy 7, like they're the ones leading studios. They're the ones, not just making the games, but they're also the ones approving the, like funding for games, right?
Yeah.
Like all along the way with Fight Magic items, like, I would like one of the like big like success stories for the book was like, when my editor was like, she was such a champion for the book internally at our publisher. Every book has to find an editor, and then they have to find an editor who can convince everybody else from marketing to sales to the publishers to write, they're like publish that book. Right. And so my editor had this great story where she was like, she showed it to her publisher, and her publisher was like, yeah, okay, let me take a look at this. Took the proposal home, and her husband, the publisher's husband, picked up the proposal, and he was like, what? Fight Magic Items, History of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the Rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. He's like, what? Yes. Like, how have you not said yes to this? Like, I need this book, And so like, you have people all along that like in every realm, everybody is, into video games in some way, right? Everybody plays games on their phone. But now we also have people in like all sorts of positions that are fans of these games. It's not niche anymore. And I think that's going to have a big positive impact on the genre going forward. I have talked a lot. I'll cede the floor.
It's good. It's good. I mean, well, obviously we try to keep the episode to an hour, but Aidan, you've had lots of great insights, and I never want to cut you off, obviously. I'll just add, in agreement with you two fellas, this continuing of blurred lines between genres. Absolutely, we're going to see this. I was tinkering with the idea in my head of, moving away from some classifications like JRPG as a category. It feels like we can have JRPGs that are their combat, they're action oriented, they're action RPGs. That's how you control the game. You do exploring, you talk to people, there are side quests, but then when you get to the combat, which is essential part of the game, you are not, this isn't a moment where time is standing still for you to make decisions and strategize that way. Instead, you have to use your dexterity, your skill to win the combat that way. And then, of course, turn-based RPGs, Bravely Default 2, Octopath Traveler, we're going to keep seeing those games, right? Like, it feels like everything Team Asano is doing with Square, these are all classic JRPGs. The invention of HD 2D, it has almost given a new lease on life to classic JRPGs, in that you have a way of making what's old new again. And now more than ever, I'm okay with games like with Final Fantasy 16 not being a turn-based RPG, because we have these smaller studios or smaller teams within larger teams that are dedicated to making the classic experiences that I have a particular fondness for. Maybe we will see a mixture of both, and we already have with something like Final Fantasy 7 Remake, right? It is an action RPG for sure, but it has moments of turn-based decision making in the way that you select items and skills. Limit breaks, things like that. Like it is flirting with the idea of turn-based combat as well. And so I'd love to see more like that. I'd love to see them keep playing with blending action and turn-based and classic and modern, and just see where that takes us at the end. But yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that Square Enix is going to continue to pump out games, and some of them are going to be good, some of them are going to be great. And what the future holds is just endlessly fascinating. And I think there was a time where I was worried that turn-based RPGs were going away. But there are just so many people and companies making games, and that grew up with the games that I grew up with and I still enjoy, that I know that these are going to have a place in the future as well. So just remains to be seen, how much experimentation happens and who ends up making these games. But I think they are going to be there to stay. Aidan, just kind of on our way out here, obviously want to people to find you and find the book, and we really appreciate having you on. But where can people find Fight Magic items? Where is that book easy to access, to pick up? Is it physical, digital, all that kind of stuff? What can you tell us?
Yeah, so Fight Magic Items was published by Running Press, which is an imprint of Hachette. You can get it anywhere books are sold. It'll be available through your local bookstore. I always try to push people towards like indie bookstores in their town because it's really important to support indie. But you can also get it, like anywhere online through an online bookseller. It's available in physical and ebook right now, and you can also find out like anything you want to know about the book on its official website, which is fightmagicitems.rocks, ROCKS. So like Fight Magic Items Rocks. It's a website I built for the book. It's a one pager. It has everything you need to know, including a ton of purchase links. So you'll be able to find a link to your favorite, online retailer, but also, it'll help you find a local indie bookstore in your vicinity that you can also support. If they don't have it on the book, on the shelves in the store, if they've sold out, they'll be able to order it in for you as well.
Awesome. And I guess after that, what is next for Aidan Moher? What's next on the horizon? Obviously, you're busy, kind of promoting the book, talking about the book. You were at some book signings today. What any plans for the future that you can reveal? What else are you going to be doing?
Oh man, nothing that I can like talk openly about.
Okay,
I mean,
the
big thing for me right now is deciding what's next. I have a few things percolating. Like I just came up with like a really exciting idea for like a follow up to Fight Magic Items.
Yeah.
That sort of explores a different facet of like what it is to be a video game fan. And I'm really excited about that idea. I haven't even told my agent about it, but it's pretty cool.
Cool.
And a few other nonfiction books that are related to what Fight Magic Items is. I'm also a fiction writer, so I have a novel that's in the cooker that my agent and I are working on and hoping to send out on proposal soon, so that hopefully that is something that materializes, and I have another big, huge JRPG inspired epic fantasy that I'm about halfway through writing. That I think anybody who loves Final Fantasy is also going to really love if they're awesome readers. So it's so much in the so many irons in the fire. I'm also just a freelance games journalist, and so I have a few deadlines coming up, and gotta juggle all of those. But that's the best kind of busy to be, right?
For sure, and thinking about just writing in general, being able to take a passion like you have for video games and to be able to produce content, produce art based on that, around that, like it's such a gratifying thing, and it helps to make work not always feel like work, and I think that's important. I'm so glad to hear it for you. So, again, thank you so much for being on the episode with us. Can people find you online as well if they wanted to interact with you, ask you questions about the book or anything else you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter way too much. My handle there is a dribble of ink, ADRIBBLEOFINK. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's the name of my old blog, a dribble of ink. And I'm on there constantly. So I always love hearing from people who have read the book or just love Japanese RPGs. You can get in touch with me there. That's probably the best place. I'm in a few also, Slack communities and stuff about Japanese RPGs. So you'll probably see me around in Discord and Slack and stuff like that.
Definitely. So Dave and I have read Fight Magic Items, really enjoyed it. Looking forward to kind of flipping through it again. Like I was rushing a little bit for it because I wanted to finish it before we talked, and I do like to go back and have another look. What really struck me again, and we hadn't really mentioned this on the episode, but there's just so much research and so many notes in the book. Like you are someone, Aidan, who has clearly done their homework, not only on the genre through playing it, through experiencing it, but talking to people about these games. From someone like Jeremy Parrish to Jason Schreier, like people who have been in games media, games press for a long time, and you getting to interact with these people and kind of go back to the writing they've done and the things they've said about JRPGs. Like it just makes the book feel so knowledgeable and well read. People should definitely pick up Fight Magic Items when they get a chance. Thank you again so much for being on the episode with us. We'd love to have you back sometime. Maybe if you've got another book in the works, or just to kind of kick back and chat about some more JRPGs. I think that'd be fun. But maybe we'll reach out in the future and see what we can make happen. That will do it for our episode. Thanks everybody for listening out there. Again, Fight Magic Items is available almost everywhere books are sold. You can check out the website fightmagicitems.rocks. Sounds like a good idea for figuring out where you can get it close to you. Thanks again, Aidan, for being with us. And yeah, thanks again, everybody, for listening. We'll wrap up here, and we'll see you next week on The Thirsty Mage. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.